Junji Ito is one of the most talented and prolific mangakas for horror, period. He is an absolute visionary whose chilling illustrations are straight up nightmare fuel. I have felt horrified, disgusted, and straight up nauseous reading his work. The meticulous and careful detailing in his manga cultivates an atmosphere of terrifying wonder that you cannot tear yourself away from. With such magnificent art, you would hope that an anime adaptation would be able to capture that. However, that track record is shaky at best. But even with all the critical failures, I still have hope that I'll be able to find an adaptation that does him justice. So I've decided to watch all of his anime adaptations to see if any of them have been able to capture that horrifying majesty that makes Junji Ito one of the greatest mangakas of our time. Since this is a very controversial topic, I would love to hear all of your opinions of which, if any of these adaptations you think did Junji Ito justice. I would also love to hear about which Junji Ito stories you would personally love to see adapted in future anime. I am so excited to talk with y'all in the comments about this since I think we all have a lot to say about the good, the bad, and the Junji Ito collection. I'm sure I'll be doing more Junji Ito videos in the future, so make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. So with that being said, let's get into it. Kicking off, we have the 2012 film adaptation of Gyo. I was very nervous about going into this one since Gyo is the most disgusting manga I have ever read and literally took me months to finish because every single chapter made me so viscerally nauseous that I could only consume one at a time. I have literally never reread it because of that, and I doubt I ever will. I was definitely nervous going into this film because 1, I heard that it wasn't very good, and 2, how can you possibly capture the horrors of this manga? I was, however, pleasantly surprised with the anime. Before we get into it though, I think we can just call the caveat across the board and agree that these adaptations will hardly ever reach the level of detail required to accurately pull off Junji Ito's work. So with that out of the way, here is what worked for me in this adaptation. I think Gyo did the best job that they could given the budget that they were given. You could tell that the animation wasn't top tier quality, but it did the job. Movement wise, it looked pretty good, and I didn't notice any jarring animation that took me out of the story. The score was also on point and probably one of the best out of his adaptations. Between that and the sound design, they were really able to keep the tension growing throughout the film. I had to take a break about 30 minutes in because I was dyeing my hair and needed to rinse it, and I gotta admit, it was really hard to pull myself away from this. The pacing was super solid, and I am very grateful that they kept it at the length that they did instead of drying it out and losing that tension. The biggest highlight for me was the gas illustrations near the end of the film. It was absolutely outstanding and showed so much potential of what this anime could have been if they'd had the resources to utilize this level of detailing throughout the rest of the film. The elements that I wish were better really just came down to detailing. When you look at the original illustrations and see what they translated them into, there's just no comparison. There were scenes in the anime that really did gross me out, but it was nothing like the manga. That manga was so visceral that it made me nauseous to the point that it took me months to finish, and the anime was just not able to pull that off, which again, I think comes back to the budget. When you compare the good to the bad, I do think that the good far outweighed the bad in this adaptation. I think the people who hate it are kind of pulling this whole thing out of proportion. Overall, I think this was a solid entry and really does not deserve the bulk of the hate that it gets. So, we are gonna give Gyo a 7 out of 10. Next up, we have the most infamous anime adaptation that inspired this whole entire video. We are, of course, talking about the 2018 anthology Junji Ito Collection, which kicked off a flurry of discourse and outrage pretty much from the moment it dropped. When I originally watched this back in the day, I didn't understand why people hated it so much. I thought it was decently solid and nothing amazing, but not bad by any stretch. The stories were super creepy and some of them were downright disturbing. It wasn't until I did a little bit more research and watched some video essays that explained the main issues to me. This video in particular did an amazing job at showing the side-by-side comparison between the anime and the original illustrations, and Jesus, the difference was downright catastrophic. Like, how do you go from this to this? This is also just a great video, so I would highly recommend checking it out. I will link it up here and in the description. So after watching that video, like everyone else, I wrote this series off and left it alone, only rewatching it 4 years later to make this video. Here are my updated thoughts. The animation is still rough, like rough movements. The voice acting didn't really match up with the animation, just rough all around. The dub kept lagging, constantly taking me out of the story, and was super distracting. Like his other adaptations, the lack of detailing, especially in the monster designs, is my main complaint. You can tell that they were definitely in the ballpark of capturing the original art at certain moments, but they just weren't able to execute it. There were, however, some standout segments that I did enjoy, including The Long Dream and Smashed. The acting and emotional moments were also pretty solid across the board. It's these good elements of the show that make the entire series as a whole so frustrating, because you can see the vision, but they just weren't able to pull it off. I think out of the entire series, there is only like one jump scare that actually got me. I am a baby when it comes to horror, so if I'm not scared, you know that it's lackluster. I really wanted to give this puppy the benefit of the doubt and say that the critical disdain was way overblown. But yeah, this just is not a great series. It's not the worst, and there's definitely still some compelling stories because Junji Ito just writes really good work. They just weren't able to fully capture it in the way that it deserved. Think I'm gonna have to keep this at its original rating and give Junji Ito Collection a 6 out of 10. Continuing on, we have the 2023 series Junji Ito Maniac, Japanese Tales of the Macabre. Like the previous entry, I feel like this one was a mixed bag, but for the most part, there were definitely more wins than losses. It was much better than the Junji Ito collection, so it kind of annoys me to hear people saying that it was equally as disappointing. The animation was better, the stories were stronger, and I really appreciated the single story episodes that focused on one instead of breaking it into two. This really gave those stories the time and respect they deserve to unfold. My favorite segments were Hanging Balloons, Long Hair in the Attic, Mold, Toontown, Unendurable Labyrinth, and Headless Statue. I think Hanging Balloons was overall the best episode, whose batshit premise absolutely went haywire by the end. Toontown was also really powerful and had some spectacular sound design. And speaking of sound design, Long Hair in the Attic had this one particular grinding sound that legitimately made my skin crawl. Mold was also a massive standout since they use a gray-toned color palette, which really let the detailing shine. In terms of body horror, Layers of Terror is probably one of the most disturbing Junji Ito adaptations I have ever seen that is going to haunt me. I am more than fine with the fact that they weren't able to adapt it in the hyper-detailed manga format, because what they did just in the anime is going to give me nightmares. That shit was f***ed. Since Maniac was coming off of the critical failure that was the Junji Ito collection, overall I do feel like this was a massive improvement. The entire series felt very solid and compelling. Unlike Collection, I didn't feel like I needed to multitask to get myself through the show, and even had to pause when I needed to answer a text or something because I was so engrossed and didn't want to miss anything. I am happy to give Junji Ito Maniac, Japanese Tales of the Macabre a 8 out of 10. All of the Junji Ito adaptations to this point have had the same problem. Transitioning Junji Ito's manga into anime always leaves out crucial detailing. This particular color grading in Gyo was very vibrant and really did not fit the vibe in the manga. Even the green and the humanoid monsters took so much from the body horror elements and made them into just generic monsters instead of humans horrifically mutilated by the virus. Ironically, Junji Ito Collection got the color palette best out of the adaptations. They really utilized more muted tones and detailed texturing. Maniac definitely felt lackluster in comparison. You can definitely see the massive difference the color palette makes when you compare the segment for Mold, which used a muted gray tone black and white palette, compared to the rest of the series. The desaturated colors really made the sheer horror of the detailing stand out so much more and just made the anime that much more visceral. In general, it is hard to know what direction to go to translate these manga. I totally understand wanting a regular anime translation using a vibrant color palette, but there's just something that completely gets lost when you translate Junji Ito's work from black and white to color. There's a massive component that none of these adaptations up to this point have been able to capture. However, we are finally ready to move on to the newest adaptation, which is the first black and white anime adaptation. Say hello to Uzumaki, the long-awaited 2024 adaptation of one of Junji Ito's most famous stories that became a cult classic and made so many of us fall in love with him. But first, let's take a deep breath, and by we, I mean me, cause this had some rough moments. I originally read Uzumaki back in 2021, and I was absolutely blown away. She was my introduction to Junji Ito, so when I heard that they were making an anime adaptation, I was so excited. But then it got delayed over and over again until it was finally announced for 2024. Each time it was delayed, I was, of course, devastated, but it also brought me joy, because it meant that they were really taking the time to do this series justice. When they released the teaser and trailers, I got even more excited. They were finally and legitimately capturing Junji Ito in a way that his anime adaptations had never gotten even close to. Literally every single year since 2021, I have said loudly to anyone who would listen that whenever this comes out, it is going to be my anime of the year, and it has the potential for legitimately changing the anime industry. From its painstakingly detailed animation to its black and white color palette, this was setting itself up to usher in a new anime era. When the first episode came out, I almost cried. It was everything I could have ever wanted between the gorgeous animation, bone-chilling score by Colin Stetson, and horrifying sound design. This first episode is a goddamn masterpiece. And then the second episode came out, and everything fell apart. I don't think y'all understand the sheer devastation I felt when I saw what happened to the animation quality. The story, score, and sound design was still top-notch, but the animation during certain parts absolutely ripped me out of the story. And I wasn't the only one devastated. The reactions across the board quickly wrote this adaptation off as yet another Junji Ito anime failure. I do think that it is very important to understand what was going on behind the scenes, though. Many people from behind the production can confirm that after the first episode, they were pretty much f***ed over, and the rest of the series fell apart because of that. They didn't want to throw away the series because so many years and thousands of hours of work went into it. It would be a disservice to everyone who worked so hard on this for it to just never come out. So they had two options. 1, only release the first episode, or 2, released all 4 episodes so that the work could at least see the light of day. I honestly and truly do not blame the production team, artists, and everyone who worked on creating this. I do, however, blame the people in charge at the top who mismanaged this series to the part where it fell apart to this degree. I was honestly scared going into episode 3, especially when I saw comments saying that this series was falling apart even more. But then I watched episodes 3 and 4 back to back, and I gotta say, y'all really need to chill the f*** out. Like, that shit absolutely slapped. Was the animation as good as the first episode? No, but it was light years better than the second. I was so happy and horrified to see some of the most iconic Uzumaki moments finally get animated. And I am happy to report that a Junji Ito adaptation finally made me nauseous. Like, my dumbass decided to eat dinner while watching, and that was a horrible mistake. There were moments that made my skin crawl that were so visceral in their body horror that I started to shield the screen. Anime has a terrible track record for being able to have scares that are on par with horror films, so the fact that this was able to capture that is a monumental moment in anime and one that deserves to be celebrated. Everything from the imagery to the disturbing bone-crushing sound design to one of the best anime scores I have ever heard, created by the visionary Colin Stetson, who also did the score for Hereditary, tied everything together and made this truly amazing. I was so terrified going into this series, and for a hot minute there, it really did break my heart. But then it picked it back up together and ended on a note that left me speechless. Now, I have chosen to remove myself from the catastrophizing discourse and hyper-focusing on the bad animation of episode 2 to take a step back and look at this series as a whole. When you put the entire series together and acknowledge that those were only a handful of scenes out of an otherwise spectacular show, I can live with it. Even with episode 2, the story, voice acting, sound design, and score were still there, and it really was only a few handful of scenes that were bad. The rest were at least average to passable. If that episode was stronger, I would have given Uzumaki a near perfect score. But because of those, we are giving Uzumaki a 9 out of 10. Now, chill the f*** out, y'all, and stop whining that it's a terrible show, because it's really not. This shit f***ing slaps. It is so popular right now to just yell about how bad Junji Ito adaptations are. And I get it, I'm super frustrated with aspects of them too. And I'm not immune from this criticism either. I also made an angry and frustrated post about episode 2 of Uzumaki and how I was worried that it was going to tank the rest of the series. So with that being said, let's all hold ourselves accountable for a minute and ask ourselves, why is it so hard for us to admit that there were good aspects to these adaptations too? For Gyo, they captured the tension through its impeccable score. The acting and pacing were on point, and some of the illustrations, especially this one, absolutely did the original artwork justice. Even the Junji Ito Collection was able to have moments in nearly every episode that hit home, either on an emotional or horror level. When it came to Junji Ito's Maniac, they were able to pull off some pretty spectacular adaptations of mold and hanging balloons. And finally with Uzumaki, y'all always harp on where it fell short. But I refuse to allow y'all to discredit the absolute masterpiece that was the first episode. This episode is hands down one of the most beautifully animated pieces of media I have ever seen. And no matter the failures of the second episode, you cannot take away from what this first episode accomplished for anime as a medium. Maybe if we're able to detach ourselves from the enraged herd and admire that elements of these anime actually do in fact work, we can create something meaningful out of it. The best way to improve your art is to fail over and over and over again. You have to keep throwing paint at the wall in hope that something sticks. And that is what I think these anime adaptations have done. Each one has created pieces that have inspired future adaptations and made those better because of them. With just how many strides that Uzumaki has made, there is even more of a chance that future adaptations will be even better. Instead of tearing it down, why don't we amplify the aspects that we love? If we're just as loud about those parts, there will be even more of a chance that we'll get to see those elements highlighted and celebrated in the future. I would personally love to see Remina be adapted, as well as my own personal Roman Empire, The Enigma of Amigara Fault. From what I've been able to understand from my research for this video, Junji Ito approved every single one of these adaptations. He gave his stamp of approval, so even if you didn't like them, there were aspects of them that Junji Ito supported enough to praise and promote them. There will always be room to improve in future adaptations, but I do think that it is grossly unfair to discount all of the strides that these adaptations made, flaws and all. Yes, you are entitled to your opinions on these, and yes, your feelings of frustration, sadness, and anger over the failures of these adaptations are valid. And I would like to encourage you to acknowledge the good that these adaptations did. Even if you didn't like any of these anime, please consider the potential that these now have for future adaptations. I want to take a moment and personally thank every single artist, animator, producer, director, and other members of staff who have helped bring these Junji Ito anime adaptations to life. You were given an impossible job to complete, and you did your best to breathe life into these wonderful stories. Thank you for everything that you did. The anime world is better with you in it, and I am so excited to see what you do next on your journey. For everyone watching, I would love to hear your takes on these anime adaptations. What did you enjoy out of them? What do you wish were better? And what ideas do you think that could make future adaptations more successful? And if you absolutely disagree with my takes on this, that's okay too. I can take the criticism. I do, however, ask that we keep it respectful in the comments. So, I'm not gonna lie, when I originally drafted this video idea, I fully intended on only focusing on the failures of these adaptations and why it is impossible to fully represent Junji Ito's work. But the more I wrote this, the more I realized that those arguments, they're just not gonna do anything. There's already more than enough discourse out there absolutely ripping them to shreds. So instead of adding to it, I wanted to try to kick off a conversation where we productively brainstorm what we can do to help future adaptations succeed. I cannot imagine how intimidating it is to work on Junji Ito adaptations, especially with his track records. So instead of tearing them down, why don't we try to build an environment that encourages future adaptations to expand on what works? I really want to thank all of you for being here and for being willing to just be a part of this conversation. We are all here because we love Junji Ito manga, and we just want the best for its anime counterparts. So I'm gonna leave it on my favorite moments that I personally think will build a better future for all of us Junji Ito fans. Thank y'all so much for sticking around, and I'll see all of y'all on the next one.